This is Booking It to Financial Freedom, show number 25. I've been very aware of a lot of these key concepts for a long time, but I don't think I ever really developed it as a habit.
We often see the world not as it is, but as we are. We basically interpret it based on how we were conditioned. So many times we don't even know that we need to change.
Stop what you're doing right now. Imagine yourself that you're looking yourself from like a corner of the room. How do you feel? How do you, this, and that? Can you change that?
He challenges you to test it for 30 days and just simply be aware of how you're reacting to the external factors around you.
Becoming more self-aware of how, are you being proactive or are you being reactive?
Yeah.
Welcome to Booking It to Financial Freedom, where we explore literature from some of the most successful experts in their field to help you build a blueprint for personal growth and financial freedom. Join us as we examine a new book every month and break down key concepts to help you get out of the rat race and on track to start building a life better than you ever imagined.
Hey everyone, I'm your host, Amanda Schneider, realtor and investor, and I'm here with my co-host and teammate, Jamie Booth. Hey Jamie.
Hey Amanda, how's it going?
Good. Welcome to the first day of summer.
Yes, and we've been making a joke over the last couple episodes about our little weather spot. So I am happy to announce to the people who are following, summer is here, and the rain seems to have subsided. So like the last couple of days, it's just been like good summer weather, hot, dry, sunny. It's really nice. And we were talking before we started, it was like, I'm almost in denial. It didn't seem like winter was ever going away. And then it started raining nonstop forever. And then the last couple of days, it's been beautiful. And it's like, is this really happening?
Yeah. Yeah. And now that you are well, you can enjoy the nice weather.
Yeah, exactly. I got a little case of the Rona.
Yeah.
And was down pretty hardcore for a week. So it was unexpected. Obviously no one expects to get, corona or virus, but it was like I'd gone all this time and completely avoided it. And
was this the first time you had it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then it just is like, we're in a state now in the world where it's kind of like an afterthought. Mm-hmm. So when it slapped me in the face, it was a good rude awakening and I got through it, but it was a miserable week for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm just happy the weather's changing a bit because I've been playing a lot of tennis, I've become obsessed with it now. And it just makes it hard when it's raining because where I play, it's all outdoor courts.
Yeah. So how's that going? Are you guys, are you still doing doubles?
We are. So I'm in a singles or like a women's league, and then Lindsay and I are in a doubles league as well. Yeah. I enjoy playing with Lindsay, but we both discovered we don't love doubles as much. Like singles is just so much more fun. You're completely responsible for the ball, You're running, you're getting more exercise, etc. So we both entered in a singles competition this weekend. So we'll see how that goes.
So what you're saying is you guys don't always play well together.
Yeah. we communicate well together, but we have we won one doubles game so far out of 3. Yeah. But we're both undefeated when it comes to singles. So
wow, that's cool. Something. Yeah. Yeah, it's one thing I've never gotten into, tennis.
Yeah, it's I didn't realize I would love it as much as I do, but I'm obsessed with getting better.
Yeah, so, and it's generally speaking, Colorado is really nice for that in the summer.
It is, yeah.
Beautiful weather all the time, so you're supposed to be.
Yeah. To segue into our book, I've taken personal responsibility to make myself better.
There you go.
No, but we are. So this is our first episode for 7 habits of highly effective people.
Yep.
Okay. It's such a mouthful. But what I love about this book, because I'm such a proponent of just taking responsibility for wherever you are in your life. And that's literally what this entire book is about, is helping us develop the habits to take that personal responsibility and then take it to the next level.
Yeah. I almost feel like we maybe should have covered this book earlier. Yeah. If anybody's actually following along in order. This would be would have been a good foundational one to start off with. But, so far I found the book to be a little bit wordy because it was written like 30 years ago, but we are using the 30th anniversary edition to cover this. So and for people who are Audible type people, I have both versions, the older version and the newer version, and the newer version is like 3.5 hours longer. With all the add-ons the updates that they've added. So it is kind of worth it to do the 30th anniversary of you already haven't invested in the older version. But
Yeah, I think the main difference is just that Sean Covey, the author's son, on some chapters basically gives his own kind of perspective, because he's also a motivational speaker, et cetera. He's kind of taken over since his father's passed. And so he gives some examples of what it was like growing up with Stephen Covey and just other things.
Yeah, and how they apply, the principles in the book apply to his upbringing and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a cool insight. I like it. I like the fact that they've added it to the end of the chapters.
Yeah, agreed. So the way that this book is kind of structured, they do a very long kind of just like intro or setup before he even starts talking about the 7 habits. So today we're going to kind of mainly just get into that intro and building up to how the habits have kind of developed and what they mean. And then we'll talk about the very first habit. And then the next subsequent episodes, we'll kind of deep dive each of the habits.
Yeah. And, there's a little disclaimer there in that opening bit too. They're talking about how, this book necessarily isn't written to just be read once.
Yes.
It's one of those ones where you should revisit it as many times as needed. Obviously, we're talking about habits here, so every habit takes time to develop. And there's also a disclaimer, don't go into the book and think that you have to spend 2 years of your life mastering habit 1 before you can start implementing habit 2 through 7. So just kind of dig into it, jump into it, but continue to revisit it until if your goal is to try to master these habits, to do it that way.
Yeah, and I think habit is the key word. We can only implement as much as we kind of understand in the beginning, and then we continue to go back and read, and it becomes a habit or something that we can do without even really thinking we're doing it after we've studied, and tried to implement and gone back. So it takes work. Any habit takes work. Yeah.
And we kind of talked about this before we started recording as well, as I've been very aware of a lot of these key concepts with habit 1 for a long time, but I don't think I ever really developed it as a habit. I was aware of it, but never really implemented the concepts within it. So which is very important that I would say, on a personal level, very important to me that I go back and try to reinforce these as a habit as opposed to just being aware of it. Obviously, being aware of it is step number 1, but implementing the habits and reinforcing that in your life is more important.
Right. And so he opens the book basically drawing a difference between what he calls personality ethic and character ethics. And I thought this was so important because he's basically saying we have to understand what the differences are, because the habits that he has developed in the book are all character ethics. So basically the difference is a personality characteristic or ethic is basically when we're trying to, I describe it as like keeping up with the Joneses. So, we can maybe get a master's degree in something and we can grow our wealth and we can do all these kind of external factors to make ourselves look like we're successful. But unless you have the true character ethics like inside, which is things like integrity, humility, honesty, patience, he talks about the golden rule. Unless we truly understand those internal factors, we can't successful incorporate these habits and go get to the next level.
Yeah, because a lot of the personality stuff is almost superficial.
Superficial, that's a great word to
Yeah,
describe.
So it's like, you can train yourself to be a better public speaker. You can do all these self-help stuff to make yourself more charismatic or whatever. But at the end of the day, the bedrock of your personality is the character traits. I thought it was interesting that he pointed out, like, because he did decades of study, before he was able, or before he authored the book, but he noticed a trend, and he points it out that, over the last 50, might be like 80 years now, depending on when he did his study. When he did the study, So he noticed that there was a huge shift in literature, all the books that were being released, like the self-help books and that kind of stuff. Prior to that shift, it was all character based, and then as we became a more modern society where it's like more go and all this other stuff, that's when all the literature shifted to focusing on personality traits as opposed to character. So I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah, absolutely. He gives the example of his son, and he he doesn't say which son. I think I had to Google this because I was curious if the son he's referring to is also the son who does, this 30th edition. Don't know if it's the same guy. But what was interesting is he gives an example of when his son was growing up, he was just kind of awkward. He was shy. They tried to get him to play baseball and he didn't have any coordination. And they were basically embarrassed by the fact that he couldn't interact socially and he didn't have any athletic skills. And so they're trying to change all of these superficial characteristics of him. They're trying to show him how to hit the ball better and like, this is how you act in public and blah, 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 rather than
doing all the positive reinforcement stuff, all that all the things they were focusing on his flaws and how they could fix it.
Yes.
As opposed to what their realization was.
Yeah. And they just, realized that we just need to accept him for who he is and encourage him and let him know that he has the strengths to do whatever he wants, and just encouraging what was innately already there. And as they did that, he grew more confident. They said there was definitely kind of a tough shift where he had been dependent on their, words of affirmation and their reinforcement and all that. And then when they kind of, stopped trying to make him fit into a mold, he kind of rebelled a little bit before he found his own confidence.
Well, they realized that they weren't accepting him for who he was. Mm-hmm. So despite all of their positive talk and all that stuff, it didn't resonate because they didn't truly mean it.
Yes.
When they come to realize that they loved him and accepted him for what he was with all of his shortcomings, everything changed for the son. Like everything started kind of making a difference as opposed to just being, word salad or whatever. Right.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. I mean, I envision that of being something like, we love you, but could you work on the way you're throwing the ball?
Yeah.
We love you, but yeah. And so, I mean, long story short, he basically grew up into somebody that was very confident. He started to take on leadership roles in high school, and he became very athletic, and he found all that himself.
Yeah, he got college, college scholarship for athletics, was like in a bunch of different leadership roles and all that good stuff. So yeah, complete change from his wimpy nerd self when he was awkward and young.
Yeah. And he gives several examples, the author does, of kind of mistakes, if you want to call it that he made with his children, but realized them after making them. And not having children, it's hard for me to kind of relate to that. But I also just think, man, that has to be so hard to just be patient and accepting your child for who they are, especially, for example, if you're a very athletic person and then you have a child that's not, or not interested in athletics, like not forcing them to be someone who they're not naturally born to be. That has to be very tough. But
yeah, I think it highly depends on the parent,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. For sure. So he talks a lot about the power of a paradigm. So a paradigm is basically just a pattern or a model. And so this relates to this personality ethics that our society kind of places upon us. So we're taught to act a certain way or be a certain way, even if it's not naturally who we are. And so he said in our heads, we have a map that is divided into two categories: the way things are, the reality, and the way things should be, which he calls values. So, we really have to understand that we need to get past that paradigm, and understanding what our true values are inside is then going to help us to express that reality of who we are, if that makes sense. So right. It's tough because, again, there's been a shift over the last 50 to 80 years of like, this is who you should be, all these self-help, but they don't really get to the internal factors. Mm-hmm. It's all about how you should look, act, and be.
Yeah, how to sell yourself as opposed to being genuine.
Yeah. But along that lines, he gives an example, and if you are reading the physical book or the online version, he has pictures of it, but he gives this example of this, what appears to be a young woman or an old woman, depending on how you look at it. Yeah.
It was like a study, right?
Yeah. What's really interesting is when he uses it in some of his workshops and stuff that he's doing. Mm-hmm. He uses an example. But when I was flipping through it, so I was flipping forward, and I saw the old woman, and then I flipped back and I saw the young woman. So basically it's a picture that when you look at it, originally you look at it one way and you can't see the young or the old woman, but it's all about perception. And that's what he uses it for, is we all see lines drawn. We all see black and white, and we all see that, but our perception is all different. Mm-hmm. So it was just such an amazing example to use of, there can be facts, but all of us interpret the facts differently based on how we were raised. So, yeah. We often see the world not as it is, but as we are is what he's saying basically. So we're, like I said, we basically interpret it based on how we were conditioned. And the whole point of this book is kind of getting past that conditioning and truly just tapping into these habits and values that we all as human beings, because he talks a lot about humans versus animals and the characteristics,
the differences between what separates us from from animals.
So these basic characteristics that make us human, tapping into those. So again, an example of a paradigm shift. He talks about one time when he was sitting on the subway and a guy comes into the subway with his 4 kids. They're super loud, rambunctious. The subway had been very calm before then. These kids come in, they're, just causing a lot of ruckus, and he's getting more and more agitated because the man isn't saying anything to his kids. He isn't, disciplining them or anything. So he finally politely says something to the man of could you ask your kids, to keep it down? And all of a sudden it seems like the man kind of snaps out of, the trance that he was in. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't even realize we just came from the hospital and their mother died. Mm-hmm. And so he tells this story to be we never know what the situation is with the other person, so we can do a lot of blaming of that person is, always in a bad mood. This person, does this or that. But we truly have to look internally and what can we do instead of blaming that person. So,
yeah, your perception is not their reality. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just a natural human flaw to project things out onto other people, right? Yeah. It's like someone cuts you off on the highway. You get mad, you'll get your road rage or whatever, flip them off or however you react. Mm-hmm. But you don't. Again, same thing. You don't know. Maybe that person's on their way to the hospital. They have an injury or something. You don't know what's going on, mm-hmm. or they're rushing home for an emergency or something like that. So the way you react is it's on you. It's not the external factors.
Exactly, because all you have control over is how you react. So, and I think it's easy to fall into that mindset because, again, society teaches us we should all be, respectful drivers, and we should be driving the speed limit, and we should be in the right lane when we're not passing, and all of these things that we should be doing. But we never know what's going on with the other person. So we also have to just be aware of those external factors, in that the only thing we can control is our reactions. So he does list some values that he thinks are basic human guidelines for human conduct. And again, he kind of uses the example of this is what makes us human versus animals. But I just wanted to kind of highlight some of these just because how he came up with his 7 habits. But one of them he talks about is fairness, integrity or honesty, human dignity, service to others, which is a theme that we've heard many times in these books that mm-hmm. we're reading. Quality or excellence, potential, and then patience and encouragement. And so these are all the true values that that we should be tapping into to help us make our decisions in life rather than these personality characteristics.
Yeah. And we're all innately aware of all of these qualities. It's just depending how you implement them in your life, right?
Yeah. And sometimes though, I would argue that we're not, we know what these are, but we're not aware when we're not, using the guidelines of some of these values. He gives the example of his daughter's friends had just basically come to him one day and said, we're having a really hard time opening up to our dad because we're just afraid of anything we say to him. He has such a short temper, and we're just afraid to say anything because he immediately snaps. And so the author had a conversation with the father, and the father was aware he had issues with his temper, but had no ability to take personal responsibility for changing that at all. He was completely unaware that it was his own responsibility to fix that in the way he was reacting to his daughter. So I would argue that a lot of us, we truly have to do some internal work to recognize some of these flaws. So, yep. So one thing he says too is the way we see the problem is the problem. So it's truly about how we're viewing things. If we're constantly saying it's such and such's fault, I can't do this because of this, it's looking at it in something that doesn't have a solution. And we need to look at things of how can it be solved. So instead of I can't, how can I? That kind of stuff. I put in a snippet here in our notes because this really resonated with me. He was giving an example of mindset that somebody who constantly thinks there's too much to do, which is me. He said, there's so much to do and there's never enough time. I feel pressured and hassled all day, every day, 7 days a week. I've attended time management seminars and I've tried half a dozen different planning systems. They've helped some, but I still don't feel I'm living the happy, productive, peaceful life I want. And his answer to that is there a chance that efficiency is not the answer? Is getting more things done in less time going to make a difference, or will it just increase the pace at which I react at the people and the circumstances that seem to control my life? Could there be something I need to see in a deeper, more fundamental way? Some paradigm within myself that affects the way I see my life, my time, and my own nature. So this, like I said, completely resonated with me because it's not a matter of how can I make more time in the day. It's something internally I need to work on to make sure I don't feel this way every day.
Yeah, this reminds me of a story that's kind of towards the end of the first habit. He's talking to his son, and his son is like looking. He's digging for sympathy.
Yes. With
his dad, and he's like, his dad asked him how he's going. He's like, oh, it's horrible. Like, I'm working so hard at the office. The office politics are crap. Like, blah blah blah. Just this long laundry list of stuff that's wrong. And his dad is like, geez, who are you? Like, why do you have such a victim attitude? And just walked away.
Yeah.
And then his son was just sitting there by himself. He's like, oh, wait. Yeah, I guess I am playing the victim here.
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself what it is you can do to get around, to do this. Like in the example here, is getting more done in less time actually the answer, right? You have control over that. Mm-hmm. You have 100% control over whether you want to work until midnight or you want to concentrate on the things that are most important and use the 80-20 rule and move on, right? And or how involved do you want to get with the office politics? That kind of stuff that's totally on you, and how you react to that is under your control as well.
Yeah, you bringing up the 80-20 just made me think of the last book we just read, Who Not How, where he was saying that most of the time 80%. Finishing a project to 80% is probably good enough because that 80 to 100%, that 20%, that's actually what's going to take up a huge amount of your time to get it quote unquote perfect when 80% is probably good enough. So that's a great example. I just think it's really hard for us to get out of that mindset of truly taking 100% responsibility because sometimes people are jerks. They are negative. Like they are all those things. But again, we don't have control over how they are acting, so all we have control over is our personal response to it. He gives another example in here when he was giving a seminar that one woman was just getting like very animated when he was talking.
Oh, yeah, that was a good example.
Yeah, and she basically was too shy to say anything in front of the group.
Well, she jumped up. She was so excited. Yeah. She jumped up and was like, telling her story or whatever, and then she realized that like there was 200 people watching her, and she like slunk back down in her chair, like.
Yeah. But he talks to her at break, and she was a nurse, a full-time nurse for basically a guy that was a complete jerk that never showed her any appreciation, was very demanding, basically just didn't even sometimes acknowledge that she was there.
Yeah.
And so her initial reaction to when Stephen Covey was giving this seminar was like, you're telling me that the way this guy acts is not my fault, but that I have to take responsibility for how he's treating me.
Yeah.
And then basically
she was completely miserable.
Yeah.
Hated her life.
Yeah. Yep. But then the light bulb just went off and she was like, oh, yeah, like I'm making the choice to stay with this person or let his
his actions make her miserable.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the realization that she didn't have to live a miserable life because of this guy's actions was like an epiphany to her.
Yeah. Which is crazy because obviously from an outsider point of view, I'm like, yeah, quit that job, or if you're able to just turn off his negativity and just do your job. An outsider is easy to see, but when you're the one involved in it.
Yeah, when you're almost drowning in it, it can be pretty hard to realize that you do have alternate choices as to how you react to it.
Yep, absolutely. And that's what's good about going back to this book, reading it over and over, having someone you love read it so that you guys can kind of point out some of those things for each other, when you're too deep in it to see. So basically the way that he designed this book is he calls it principle-centered, an inside-out approach. And we've kind of already talked about that, but truly looking inside to see how you can change the outside world rather than letting the outside world continually have effects on you.
I'm sure we'll talk about it later on, but that's basically your circle of influence.
Yes.
So by looking inside, you're looking at what you can control,
Yep.
as opposed to all of the outside factors that you have no control over.
Yep, absolutely. And he just emphasizes that how can you improve relationships if you still have a lot of work to do on yourself?
Mhm.
So it's improving yourself first. And he gives the example of there was a guy that came to him that said, my wife and I, we have fallen out of love, but we have, 3 children. Like, what do? We don't want to get a divorce, but we don't love each other. And he said, well, then you just need to love her. And he's like, but I'm telling you, I'm out of love. And he was just saying, you need to look at love like a verb. You need to treat her with loving actions, affirmations and supporting her, etc., rather than love as a feeling, because through our actions, we can create those feelings in both people.
Yeah. It goes into the book or later on talking about how people who are really reactive to their feelings are reactive as opposed to proactive people.
Mm-hmm.
So letting your emotions control you is a downfall, right? It's that's being reactive as opposed to proactive.
Yeah. And it's, that's really hard. It's easier said than done, really hard, especially when you're in a relationship.
Oh, we'll say emphasize that, he does push the point, like this book is it's about making you better.
Mm-hmm.
So before
Yes.
you go on trying to fix everybody else, concentrate on yourself, make yourself better, get yourself sorted out, and then hopefully the rest of the stuff will come, externally, will just kind of fall into place.
Yeah, it's kind of like the domino effect that they explain in the one thing, where it's like if you work on yourself and only the things that you can control, it should have an effect where your circle of influence grows. Maybe people around you see that you're improving yourself. They see that you're not reactive. And so, because a lot of times, especially when it's husband and wife or people in a relationship, if I react, then they're going, then Lindsay's going to react to me. Like it's just something that sets people off. So if you can be the first one to not react and to just have a discussion, it makes a huge difference. So there's a few key things that he kind of points out before he introduces the first habit. And so I wanted to kind of talk through some of those. He defines what an actual habit is, which I'd never heard it defined like this, and I really liked it. So he says it's the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. Knowledge is knowing what to do and why we're doing it. Skill is how to do it. And then the desire is wanting to do it. Mm-hmm. So many times we don't even know that we need to change, just like that example I gave of the father. Like we truly don't even have the knowledge to know that we need to change something. So again, a lot of this has to do with some internal work within ourselves. And at the very end of this podcast, I'll give some tips that he provides in the book of just like a 30-day exercise that you can do for yourself to kind of just do some internal work.
Yeah. And he talks about how, we can develop, habits aren't forever. I think there was an example he used, forging a habit as like creating a cable one strand at a time. Mm-hmm. And once you have woven enough of the cable fibers together, it's unbreakable. But he also says that that's not true, because we can break habits just as easily as we build them.
True.
Or not as easily, but it depends, whether or not we've spent 60 days developing a habit doesn't mean that we can break that habit, 6 months down the road. So I think it was where it's kind of relevant to realize that the triangle of how he defines the habit. So if the desire is not there,
right,
no matter how hard you work on that habit, it's not going to stick because you have no desire to continue to maintain it. So
yeah, that's a great point, especially because habits can be good things and they can be bad things. So like the habit of smoking, obviously, if you don't have the desire to improve your health and quit smoking,
you're never going to break it. Yeah.
You're not going to break it. All right. And then he really takes some time to differentiate between dependence, independence, and interdependence. So basically we all kind of start out in life being dependent. We're babies and, we need all of our needs taken care of for us. And we begin to grow up and learning independence. And, when we become teenagers, we even kind of start to rebel against our parents because that's us growing and being more independent. But a lot of people, unfortunately, kind of stop at that independence and they don't understand interdependence, which means being able to be independent, but realizing that working with others is actually going to get you so much farther than just being independent.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot in some of our past books about understanding that you're not the smartest person in the room, that you should seek out subject matter experts and lean on their expertise to build and develop a team or whatever it may be. But just to be able to be interdependent with those other people to grow and find success that way.
Yeah, absolutely. We discussed that a bunch in the previous book, Who Not How. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, I would definitely go back to that. But he even calls it a personal maturity issue, that a lot of times people become so independent because they are worried about others having too much say in what they do. And, for whatever reason, again, how we're raised or whatever, we just can't seem to ask others for help. But it's really that maturity that you need to understand, like we've already said, that you're going to get farther with other people.
Oh yeah. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I mean, it's like, you actually have it in the notes here about the who, not how principles, but yeah, exactly. It's like, if you're stuck, don't be so prideful that you can't ask for help, or be ashamed because you think, and we were talking about this in the last book, where people have this perception that they're cheating somehow if they ask for help or whatever. Yeah. It's like, it's something you have to grow past that.
Right. And it's, the reverse is true too. You don't want to be so dependent on people that you don't have your own independent thoughts and abilities. It's all about developing our own skills of what we're best at so that we can also contribute. Mm-hmm. So then he also talks about, he calls it keeping your P and your PC in balance. So P is what's being produced, and then PC is production capacity. So he tells the story of the golden egg, where I'm sure we've all heard this. I feel like I grew up with this story, but basically this chicken he lays a golden egg one day, and the farmer is obviously elated, finds out it's like pure gold. And every day the chicken is laying this golden egg, and so his wealth grows and grows, but then he starts to get greedy. And so he doesn't want to wait for another day for just one egg a day. So he kills the chicken in hopes that all of these golden eggs are inside the chicken, and they're not. And so now he's killed the thing that is producing his wealth. And so the author really talks about, you have to keep what you're producing and then your capability to produce that in check, because if they become out of balance, then your success can't grow.
Yeah. He digs into this a lot, and I really liked it. Is like he uses different examples where he points out, like, you have to identify what is producing the golden egg. Mm-hmm. So, it could be an aspect of your relationship or whatever it is. Like, you don't want to, once you recognize what is producing, you don't want to destroy that.
Yes.
So, and it takes on many different forms, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it could be something physical. He uses the example of the guy who found success in the warehouse or whatever, the industrial thing where he like ran the machine to death. Obviously, that machine was producing things, got profit margins way up, all this other stuff. But because he was running it into the ground, he got a promotion, moved on, and he left it to the next guy. Well, the next guy inherited, a dud.
Right.
Like, the machine was like at the end of its life, and it was breaking down. It was costing all this maintenance and all that stuff. So in that example, that machine was producing the golden egg. So you have to maintain it. So he uses the maintenance side of, like, example, like, you can't neglect whatever it is that's producing the golden egg for you. You have to nurture and maintain that. And then, like I say, it could be a physical thing or a aspect of a relationship or whatever. So don't take advantage of things that are good things, right?
Yeah.
Like, good thing in a relationship.
Absolutely.
You take advantage of that, you destroy it. Well, now you've just killed your goose, right? So.
Right. No, that's great. Yeah. And this, I just keep thinking in that example, like, it has a lot to do with our health too, because we'll do that in the pursuit of success and wealth. We run our bodies into the ground as well, and don't, nurture them with physical activity or the right foods, for example. So he does, and you already said a lot of these things, but I liked what he wrote here. He said excessive focus on a P, which is just the production, results in ruined health, worn out machines, depleted bank accounts, and broken relationships. But too much focus on the production capacity is a person who runs 3 or 4 hours a day thinking that they're improving their health, and then realize they spent half their life running.
Yeah, it's like it's like you run all that time bragging that you've extended your life for 10 years, but in reality, you just spent 10 years of that life running.
Yes. So that was good. Okay. And then again, before he gets into the first habit, he talks about how we should use this book. And you already kind of talked about some of this, which I loved in the beginning, so people kind of have an idea. But habits 1 through 3 really deal with self-mastery. Again, working on us before we can even attempt to help others or work on others. So, moving that needle from dependence to the interdependence. And then habits 4 to 6 is about teamwork, cooperation, and communication. And then finally, the 7th habit, he says, if it's deeply internalized, is actually a renewal of the first 6 that will make you truly independent and capable of effective interdependence. So to me, it's a circle where you just keep going through all of it. You get to that 7th habit, you renew. Now I'm visiting habit 1 again and seeing how I can continue to improve and just making that a cycle. So again, if you bought the 30th anniversary edition, Sean Covey has a chapter in there where he talks about what the habits are not, which I really liked, because when you listen to, it's basically the opposite of the 7 habits. And when you listen to him, you're like, of course I would never act like that, but we do. And we don't even realize we're acting like it. So habit 1, instead of being proactive, he says the opposite would be reactive. So reacting to everything, just immediately getting upset about stuff. Habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. And again, the opposite is beginning with a squat in mind, not having anything, not knowing what your focus is, what your goal is.
Right, yeah.
And we've done a lot of, work on that too, your why and your goals, things like that.
Begin with squat in mind. It kind of reads weird, but it's like, I ain't got squat, right?
Ain't got squat, yeah.
It's kind of, I don't know if people even use that word that much anymore.
I don't know either.
This was written in the 80s.
But then habit 3 is put first things first. Put first things first. So, and his was put first things last. So like the most important thing, you're obviously not going to leave that for last. You're going to do the most important thing first. That obviously makes sense, but a lot of times we don't. We procrastinate. Right. And that was kind of the who, not how. If we're constantly procrastinating, it's something that needs to get done, but maybe we need to find the right people to do it. Habit 4 is win-win. And obviously the opposite is think, win, lose. And we would never do that. Why would we think win and then losing in the end? We wouldn't do that. Habit 5 should be seek first to understand, then be understood. And he says, habit 6, the opposite would be an island. And of course that makes sense, but do we do that? A lot of times we do try to do things all by ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then the last habit, he said, obviously the opposite would be burn yourself out, when it should be synergize and renewal. But we don't do that. We a lot of times work ourselves to death, and then we don't have anything left to put out.
Yeah.
So
it's one of the biggest regrets everybody has. I mean, you see it over and over. All these people who are interviewed on their deathbed, they always ask, what's your biggest regret? And then a lot of time is, working yourself to death and then not experiencing things. So
yeah. Okay, so we're finally going to get into habit 1. Again, this is a longer book, so if you are reading this or listening, like it is worth listening to all of it through the end, because he gives so many examples and just kind of reiterates everything. But habit 1, be proactive. So again, kind of the whole theme of this book, but is the starting habit is taking responsibility, having self-awareness, which is what makes us different from animals. Animals don't have that self-awareness, but we're able to actually look back and evaluate our feelings and our thoughts, unlike animals can, and take responsibility for why things happened.
Yeah. And it's like the example he uses in the book as far as like what separates us from animals is he says, like, stop what you're doing right now. Imagine yourself that you're looking yourself from like a corner of the room. How do you feel? How do you, mm-hmm. this and that. Now you have the conscious ability to make, like, can you change that or whatever, right? So that is the main thing that separates us from animals, is the ability to be able to like change our consciousness, reinvent ourselves, to identify the fact that, we can completely reinvent ourselves if we need to change or whatever like that. So it was a pretty neat little example that he used there in the book.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, animals just have instinct and they act on that instinct.
And they can be trained, but he was saying, he says that they don't have the, the animals can be trained, but they can't take responsibility for their training.
Right.
So
yeah, that's a good point. So again, he talks about a stimulus and response. So, how we're responding to some of these stimuluses, and he gives the example of Viktor Frankl, and a lot of you probably know that name. He's an author. His most famous book is Man's Search for Meaning, but he was in the Holocaust, and he just
very powerful story.
Yeah, he just went through some horrific things, but realized one day when he was in a small cell, naked and alone, that the one thing they can't take away from him is how he reacts to his situation that cannot be taken away from him. And it basically just leads him down this path of a lot of evaluation of this self map of the things that are just inherent to us that nobody can take away from us. And that proactivity is one of them. It's something we naturally have, is taking responsibility for our lives. But a lot of times, just the way we're conditioned in society, we, for some reason, unlearn that.
Yeah. It's a really cool story. He goes a little further into, his background, Victor's background in the concentration camps and stuff. But what that kind of what separated him from the other prisoners, obviously, I think his wife, his entire family died. I think him and his sister were the only two that survived in his family. But the way he talked to himself while he was in those horrendous conditions after, I don't know if it was after he had the realization that, that was the one thing that the Nazis couldn't take away from him. But even when he was in his cell, like you said, living in the conditions he was imagining himself teaching students after the fact, after he was out. It's like he was teaching, in his mind, he was teaching lessons of the Holocaust to students in the future. Like that was his mindset. Everything was kind of, instead of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm here, this is the end. Like, at any given time he could have been chosen to be, executed or whatever. But he was constantly telling himself, like, think positive things and envisioning them for when he was released.
Yes. Yeah. The power of positive thinking, for sure. They say, or the author says in the book, if you choose to be reactive to things, then you are giving power to those things to control you. So you truly have to realize that by being reactive, you're giving more power to those outside forces. And he gives the example of some people, if the weather's good, then they feel great. If the weather's crappy and it's raining, then they feel crappy. But somebody who's proactive doesn't care what the weather is like. No matter what, it makes no difference to them how that affects their day. Some people are and maybe it's the difference of some people being a bit more empathetic or something, I don't know, but they let others' emotions truly affect them, where you have to just be who you are regardless of what your environment is around you. And he gives some examples of ways that we can change the talk that we have with ourselves, just like Victor. And I love this. It's truly just changing a word or two in the way you talk to yourself. So, for example, if, reactive language would be, well, there's nothing I can do, where proactive language is, let's look at the alternatives. What are some options of things I can do? Reactive language, that's just the way I am. Proactive language, I can choose to take a different approach of something. And he talks in here about the difference between haves and bees, which I really like. Again, it's the language is, you don't have to do anything. It is your choice to do it. So I'll be happy when I have my house paid off. If I only had a more patient husband. Instead, somebody who's proactive uses the word be. I can be more patient. I can, I can be wiser and be loving. I can give more money towards my house to get it paid off, things like that. So I love that because it's truly changing just one or two little words of how we talk about ourselves.
Positive self-talk, it's huge.
Yeah. And you talked about this a little bit already. You talked about the circle of influence, but there's a difference between your circle of concern and your circle of influence. Do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, I saw this a lot in the military too. I don't know if as a matter of fact, I don't know if all the military slides I ever saw was like, pulled from the teachings of this book or whatever, but basically you live your life and you have your circle of influence. And that's the smaller circle if you don't have the book or you're just listening. So it's a diagram. So your circle of influence is the small circle in the center. And all of those things are like what you have direct control over, right? Yep. Like getting out of bed on time, cleaning your room, doing all those things, or immediate contacts, right? So people that you like your spouse or your children, your very closest friends or whatever, those are kind of within your circle of influence. Well, everything else falls into the circle of concern. So if, again, like maybe a politician has made a decision that you don't like, or I don't know, your basketball team loses or whatever, all that stuff that's outside of your direct control falls within your circle of concern. You should be aware of it, but you shouldn't fret and spend all of your emotion, energy, time worrying about the stuff that's in the circle of concern, because there's nothing, at the end of the day, there's nothing you can do about it. So you have to concentrate on the direct action items that are within your circle of influence that you can actually control. Otherwise, you're just beating your head against the wall.
Yeah. And I think he even says in the book too, the more you concentrate on your circle of influence and kind of disregard the circle of concern, the more your circle of influence will grow. So those should actually be similar in size. So, we typically start out with a smaller circle of influence and a huge circle of concern, but the more we concentrate on that influence, the more it should grow. Because again, people see the way you're reacting. They try to, kind of imitate what you're doing, or you're not reactive to people, which makes them not reactive. And it just, it grows.
Yeah. If you want your circle of influence to grow, then you have to grow yourself.
Yes.
Right. That's the key concept here is by becoming more valuable to the people around you by, seeking additional training or certifications, spiritual things, whatever it is that you have to grow yourself, naturally your circle of influence will start to grow, right? So like using the example of the politician, you don't like the local politics or whatever. Well, how could all of those decisions, if you're not a politician, are just completely out of they're in your circle of concern, they're out of your control. But by, running for office or whatever, suddenly your circle of influence has grown, right? So now you have something that you can actually influence and control at that point. So but up until that point, don't beat yourself up about it because it's fruitless.
Yeah, I think that's great. So that kind of brings us to the end of the first habit. And he leaves us with some actionable steps that we can take. So basically, he said the very first thing to grow your circle of influence is to make and keep commitments and promises to yourself. So you're committing to taking what we've discussed today in the podcast and actually, being less reactive, understanding where people are coming from, some of those things that we can physically control. And so he says he challenges you to test it for 30 days and just simply be aware of how you're reacting to the external factors around you, and try to be the light, not the judge, be a model, not a critic, and be part of the solution and not the problem. So truly just taking 30 days to kind of observe how you're reacting and try to be this more positive
Becoming
influence.
more self-aware of how, are you being proactive or are you being reactive?
Yeah.
I can't undermine how important this concept is about keeping promises and commitments, especially to yourself. So if you can't keep a promise or a commitment to yourself, you're not going to, that's the biggest tragedy that you could do is like, you can't even be honest with yourself, right? So if you can't even be honest with yourself, how are you treating and having relationships with everybody else if you can't even be honest with yourself?
Yeah.
So it's something that's very important that you have to kind of like look inside yourself and be like, am I being honest with myself, right? Am I honoring my commitments and my promises to myself and to the people around me? Because it makes all the difference in the world.
I think one of the biggest indicators that we're not being honest with ourselves or with others is when you're trying to justify your actions. Rather than just taking
when you're trying to project or play the victim or all these things that we've kind of talked about in covering this first chapter and the other books. But yeah, what was the statement that he had earlier in there? Like if you have to ask yourself about the problem, that is the problem, right? So if you find yourself doing that, and that should be like a red flag, like, oh, you got to step back and rethink this for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. I think that about wraps it up.
Cool. We want to talk about, I guess, normally our format for our covering our books, we normally do 3 episodes and a guest, but we're going to just go ahead and deep dive. So if anybody's expecting episode 4 of this book to be a guest, it's not going to be this time, because I think we're going to pay this book a little bit more attention because it is lengthier and there's a lot of stuff to dig into. So we're excited about just covering the book as thoroughly as we can.
Absolutely. And then, alternatively, if you listen to this one and, the 7 habits have totally changed your life, reach out to us. We'd love to have you as a guest.
Absolutely. Yeah. Give us some, especially if you have personal experience, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. You want to take us out?
Sure. So if you found any value in today's episode, please like, share, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. Don't forget that we are on not only YouTube, but on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So please continue to support the channel. And we really appreciate everybody out there. And we're looking forward to continuing this journey. We're on episode 25.
Yeah.
Wow, it's getting up there really quick. So, yeah, and we're not going to stop anytime soon. So thanks, everybody, for your support. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Talk to you next time.
See you next time.